Good morning and welcome to Asia Society Australia and today's China Executive Briefing, China Tech and the Impact of Geopolitics. I'm James Scullin, the Program Director here at Asia Society Australia, coming to you from our offices at the Asia Trade and Innovation Hub here in Melbourne. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today, I'm speaking to you from the Bunrawong and Wurundjeri lands of the East Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. As always, thank you to the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for supporting our China Executive Briefing series over the last 2 years. I'd also like to thank our project partners, China Policy, who prepared our most recent policy brief on the latest developments in China's cross-border e-commerce market. This latest brief looks at how China's domestic and international e-commerce platforms boomed during the pandemic and how China is now seeking to use its expertise in online retail to write the rules for global e-commerce markets, including across the Belt and Road. If you've not yet read the brief, you can click on the link you'll find in the chat box below your screen now. Well, throughout this China Executive Briefing series, we've been looking at individual sectors and their domestic developments across China's economy and what they mean for Australian and Western businesses. All the while, it's been difficult to ignore some of the geopolitical realities now shaping much of China's relations with the West, where terms such as de-risking and even decoupling increasingly frame much of the relationship. On today's program, we'll be exploring how heightened tensions between China and the West is felt across key sectors of China's economy and what impact this is having on Western firms looking to re-engage with the China market. And it's in the area of technology where much of the competition is being felt. We look at semiconductors, where we've now seen the onset of what has been described as a chip war, as now both the US and China are looking to protect the key technology and critical minerals that go into manufacturing high-end chips, critical to any tech supply chain. The technological rivalry between the US and China is also heating up in artificial intelligence as both nations strive to boost productivity and competitiveness. And then there's the question of how all this competition is being felt at the consumer level and across the digital platforms that have long been a retail gateway to China's middle class. So it's an ambitious program today, and to help us explore these themes, we're joined by our expert panel. Joining us from Taiwan is Cheng Ting-Fang, who is the Chief Tech Correspondent with Nikkei Asia. Ting-Fang covers hardware, semiconductor supply chains, and the intersection of chips and US-China geopolitical tension. Ting-Fang has received numerous awards for her business reporting, ranging from China's chip ambition to the US crackdown on Huawei. Joining us from Oregon, Kendra Schaefer is a partner at Beijing-based strategic advisory consultancy, Trivium China. She leads the Trivium Tech Policy Research Team, keeping investors, companies, and governments briefed on Chinese tech regulation, government data and tech infrastructure projects, and the data and technologies underpinning China's social credit system. And Mark Tanner, joining us from New Zealand, is Managing Director at China Skinny, one of the best-known marketing and research agencies in China. Mark has quickly grown into one of the world's foremost China marketing experts and has worked with over 200 brands, including Nike, P&G, Colgate, Panasonic, Tourism Australia, IKEA, Fonterra, and Zespri. For attendees, throughout our discussion today, please feel free to submit any brief questions or comments in the Q&A box below your screen, and our panel will endeavour to incorporate any comments or questions into today's discussion. So please let us know your thoughts. So Ting-Fang, I'll come to you for the first question, and I'd just like you to please explain to us what a semiconductor is, why they're so crucial to the global economy, and with only a handful of countries able to produce the best chips, namely the US, Taiwan, and Japan, what is it about the technology of semiconductors that make it so challenging for countries like China to quickly catch up in?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Semiconductors are these tiny integrated circuit and memory components, so-called chips. And where can you find those chips? If you open up your mobile phone, you will see a printed circuit board inside, and all those black squares on the printed circuit boards are chips. You can also open your TV, like break it down, and the refrigerator, computers, cars, and any of the electronic devices you can imagine, from also airplane and then data center servers to actually missile systems to satellites, cannot run without these chips. And also you're asking which country can produce these chips. Let me give you this number from Boston Consulting Group. This is referring to global wafer fabrication capacity, or more easier to understand, chip manufacturing capacity. So Taiwan and South Korea both control about 20%, and Japan is about 17%. China actually has 16%, US is about 13%, Europe 8%, Singapore and Israel are about 7% together. So actually you can find that East Asia is very critical to chip production, chip manufacturing. Nearly 75% of chip manufacturing happening here. And Taiwan is very famous as it has a big market share in the so-called logic chip production. So what are logic chips? They are like mobile processors, modem, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth connectivity chips, also those AI accelerators, CPUs and GPUs. And then Taiwan is the leader in cutting edge chip production, especially when a lot of people are referring to. But that cutting edge chip production actually only is only a small portion of a single percentage of total semiconductor production. So actually you need so many different types of chips. And if it's about a memory chip production, you cannot forget South Korea, because South Korea controls 44% as a country for DRAMs and NAND flash memory, all those storage components. So it's very, very important. And then Europe is doing great in like automotive related chips, power related chips. And US is also very good at CPUs for servers and computers, and also has a meaningful memory chip industry as well. Also, US got all the best chip design companies. And you are especially asking about China. So actually China, like I did say, 16% also play actually a key role in the semiconductor supply chain. And as a lot of like chip equipment makers from ASML to Applied Material all recognize this fact that it's actually an important producer for a lot of like mature and legacy chips, such as like driver ICs for your displays, microcontrollers, and power management chip, also middle end to entry-level processors for consumer goods. And also, don't forget, Samsung and the SK Hynix of South Korea have massive memory chip production footprints over there in China. So also, why China now is facing some headwinds and why it's so difficult to build a semiconductor industry. I think the reason is all the same for all the countries. Like no one country can do all of the supply chain like alone, and really like no one can master all the segments. The semiconductor industry is actually a very globalized industry for a very long time, and the supply chain is extremely long and complex. It's not only about chip production itself, it's about like hundreds type of chip making equipment that need to form a complete production line. It's also about so many different types of chip making materials, industrial gases and chemicals, and it's also about chip design tools. So actually it needs an ecosystem. So previously, I think China is really catching up in semiconductor industry, but US now is really a team up with its allies to stop China from using all these like advanced chip making tools and regulate technology sharing and also regulate the talent flows. So all of these create headwinds for China's semiconductor industry because it's such a globalized industry. And if you cannot get global collaboration, you will face significant headwinds.
Well, yeah, thank you, Ting-Fang. That's such a like overarching introduction to our conversation. And, it seems that with China, there's issues around manufacturing just due to the whole complexity of the semiconductor industry. But now with, increased US-China competition, we have the CHIPS Act, sweeping export controls brought in by the US last year. And now recently we're seeing some pushback from China around critical minerals as well. What type of impact is this geopolitical struggle between US and China now having additionally on China's chip sector?
Yes, I think all these competition about US and China is about who is the next tech and the military supremacy, and who has the say for future geopolitics for all over the world. And semiconductor just happen to be at the center of our future technology development. They are enablers for supercomputers, AI, mixed reality, and autonomous driving, which are all very critical to our future technology development and also very essential for next generation weapons. So actually, what I heard is that actually US is most concerned about China is using American technologies to advance its military expansions. So basically, US previously found that it's very difficult to only target military, as there are so many components that are civilian and the military dual use. Like drones, how to define which is a civilian and which is a military. Also about AI, it can go into consumer electronics, it can go into servers, but it can also go into AI computing for surveillance gears or military equipment to build next generation weapons. So the line is very blurred. So why semiconductor is at the center is US realized that they need to target all the technologies. So that's why semiconductor are caught in between. And then about the CHIP Act that you brought up, and then because of the time, I will only bring up one point that in the CHIP Act that will not only affect U.S. companies, but other countries. Like taking the US grant right now will mean that maybe your corporate expansion plans could be affected in the future. For example, I just mentioned Samsung and SK Hynix both have massive production complex, one in Xi'an and another SK Hynix in Wuxi. And while TSMC also has manufacturing sites in Nanjing and Shanghai. So if one company take the grants from the US CHIP program, you cannot do R&D take license in the country that US have concerns. Obviously now is China, or expand semiconductor manufacturing capacity in countries of concern for the next 10 years. So actually, if you take US grants, you have to rethink your whole expansion plans in China. Otherwise, you will have to return the full amount of the award, and it will call a lot of attention as well. So I think that's why that's about the CHIP Act.
And Ting-Fang, do you think some of these controls by the US government will actually motivate China to have, a stronger domestic chip industry as a result?
Yes, I think actually China is really trying to catch up, and this like massive US export control, especially the one introduced October 7th last year. I think it's the first time that the export control are not only targeting specific companies, like putting only Huawei or more Chinese companies on the blacklist. It's even broader because it's setting technology nodes, setting specs to limit the whole China have the access to the latest version of cutting edge chips. So, but China, of course, that also served as a wake-up call for China. But I just they previously, during early 2000, they already hoped to build a semiconductor industry. Also, in 2014, the second wave of their semiconductor investment also happened over there. But by that time, they always think about a semiconductor production, only like the chip manufacturing itself. But now with all the export control. They are thinking overall supply chain, like they are trying to nurture their own homegrown semiconductor equipment makers, material makers. They are trying to duplicate if they could do some domestic chip design tool makers. But actually, why it's very difficult is because those companies like Applied Materials, ASML, Nikon, Canon, Tokyo Electron, those kind of company already exist in the market for so long, and then they have this accumulated knowledge. But now China want to like completely rebuild their own supply chain. It's quite difficult. If they could have access to like Japan's like precision components or European precision components, then that's easier. But however, the US hope their the allies, like including Japan and the Netherlands, can already introduce their own export control. So we are now monitoring whether US allies like Japan and the Netherlands will really execute those export control very, very strictly.
Now, Ting-Fang, you're based in Taipei, and you've already mentioned, Taiwan's strength in the semiconductor industry, particularly with its leading company TSMC. I think a lot of the times when we think of Taiwan and potential military conflict, we do think of the terrible strategic consequences of that. But with Taiwan's huge power in the area of semiconductors, in the event of a potential military conflict between China and Taiwan, what impact would a conflict or embargo have on global supply chains, just given the predominance of Taiwan in that industry?
Actually, here I have some numbers for you again. The first one is from the White House supply chain review report saying that a disruption in the production of logic chip in Taiwan could cause nearly 500 billion in lost revenues for electronic devices manufacturers that depend on this supply chain. Also, a recent estimate by a Rhodium Group say Taiwan conflict could put about 2 trillion of economic activity at risk, and many unknown consequences may follow. But I actually want to say is that the impacts are more wider than just those numbers. Of course, first, when it comes to Taiwan, people think about chips. Yes, that's right. TSMC, the world's biggest contract chip maker, builds all the iPhone processors, MacBook CPUs, Wi-Fi modem, gyroscope, wireless charging, anything you can imagine. And also the GPUs by AMD and NVIDIA also are built in Taiwan. So, but not only Taiwan has the chip manufacturing, after chips are built, it needs to be packaged and tested. Also, Taiwan also has the world's biggest outsourced chip packaging and testing industry. Also, you need that print circuit board to mount it, load all those chip on and put into the electronic devices, which are the PCB print circuit board industry. Taiwan also control about 30% of global market share, just to name a few. And then I want to stress is that the value chain are very interconnected. So let me share also about this. It's a Nikkei Asia analysis that we look at Apple's top suppliers together. Actually, there are more than 270 facilities making Apple's product or components in China. And there are some more than 70 facilities in Taiwan making parts for Apple. And all these parts in Taiwan actually need to likely ship to China to make the final product. So you can see if there is a conflict over here, all these productions, these several hundreds, could be totally affected. It's not only Taiwan will be affected, but the whole supply chain that connected to it will be affected.
Okay, well, thanks, Ting-Fang. On that, rather grave note, we might just park it there for semiconductors. But if anyone has any questions for Ting-Fang, please type into the Q&A chat. Kendra, we'll move on to you now, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
You do a lot of work in artificial intelligence, and when we think of AI in China, it was long mooted that China had the potential to leapfrog the West in terms of AI technology. I was just looking to get a read from you on China's current AI development today compared to that of the West? And in what areas, if any, China has a potential strength in or is leading in compared to the West?
Sure. Well, I guess the first question to ask there is what we mean by development. And the second question is what we mean by the West. I'm just going to take the US because that's easier. I'll stand in as a proxy for the West. But depending on the metrics we're looking at, the answers are wildly different, right? We could look at talent. How many, AI researchers does China have? How many development shops do they have, right? We could look at computing power. How much data processing power, how many chips, and how much hardware, right? And how advanced that hardware is. We could look at regulation, which is what I mostly do all day, right? Who's ahead in developing the laws and regulations that lay a clear path for the development of the AI industry, right? And we could look at data and data availability. Which country or region has better data for AI training, right? And I'm sure we could look at a million other things. So on some of those, we could say China's ahead. On some of those, we could say the US is ahead. And on some of those, it's too early to call, right? Or it's complicated. In terms of establishing AI regulations, China's light years ahead of the United States and a little bit ahead of Europe, right? Light years. The US doesn't even have a federal data privacy law. Okay, we don't even have the foundation. That is the foundation necessary for writing AI regulation, deciding what you're allowed to do with data or what you're not, right? We don't have that yet. We're not even really seriously discussing it in Congress yet. So, the EU is doing much better in that regard. China, on the other hand, has multiple data protection laws. Whatever you think of those laws, they do exist. And they also have 3 big regulations specifically targeting AI, right? But those regulations do put some boundaries around what AI developers are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, what kind of data they're allowed to use, right? That could hamper innovation. Not saying it will, but it could. We could get into that in Q&A later if anybody wants to talk about it. In terms of talent, though, I'd say the US is ahead, right? China's got, they've got AI talent. They've got good AI companies, but the numbers indicate that they're still fighting brain drain. Chinese AI researchers still go to Western countries a lot. Universities are very poorly set up to churn out job-ready STEM graduates. Something that the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Science and Technology are working to fix, but that's a years-long process, right? That's a 2-decade process. In terms of hardware, right, the data processing power needed, right, the jury is still out for all the reasons and uncertainties that Ting-Fang just underscored, right? The US, the Netherlands, and Japan are getting together to impose these controls that will block China from getting access to the most advanced chips and equipment, right? But here's the thing, the impacts on China's AI industry, the ability to train an AI based on those export controls are totally unknown right now for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that China has several national plans in place to kind of mitigate the impact of those chips, the lack of access to chips, national plans that get almost no airplay in Western media. Things like, the state has decided that computing power should be a kind of resource that the government is expected to provide to innovators, right? The government's like stepping in to provide this computing power, create supercomputing networks that researchers can use, this kind of stuff. So jury's out on who's ahead there. And then finally, in terms of data availability, also super complicated, right? That story has not been written yet. China's AI and data rules put a lot of boundaries around what kind of data can and cannot be used for AI training, right? Which is currently limiting, right? We hear from major tech companies is currently limiting what Chinese AI innovators can do. On the other hand, the state is actively pushing to develop data sets and encourage the development of data sets that can be used for AI training, right? That are state approved for AI training models, right? Now you look at the US, there's very few rules about that. And data availability is mostly market driven. These are 2 separate models. Which one ends up, playing out, right? And the government doesn't get involved in data availability, right? That's just it's not really the sandbox it plays in. So, which one of those models ends up, generating winners, a little too early to say. So that's the kind of big picture view on development.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. Just on that point you mentioned around, the regulatory pace of the US, against China.
Yeah.
What do you put that down to? Is that down to the actual complexity of the technology in itself? Is it into the issues in the US Congress and the political issues? Or is it something more around the fact that, China, a lot of the major decision makers in China do have training as engineers? Does that make them a little more able to grapple with these issues than we do in the West, where, maybe there isn't the same preponderance for training in engineering that there is in Chinese leadership?
Where senators ask Mark Zuckerberg why they're getting spam emails during congressional hearings. Yes. I think all of that plays a role, but ultimately, China has a regulatory agency responsible for the internet, right? And so that regulatory agency just sits around all day making internet policy, right? Well, the States actually doesn't have anything like that. We have a bunch of different agencies that are kind of over parts of the internet, but nobody's like the internet regulator. So that's probably playing a role. The technological, training of our politicians is playing a role, but actually, ultimately, the policy that China is writing now on the internet is a continuum of policy they were writing 20 years ago. And these policies have incrementally built upon each other until now the fundamental ideas that formed Chinese internet regulation in the early 2000s are informing AI policy now through the lens of modern technology, right? And all these kind of evolving changes. But if you'll excuse me for saying so, China's being advantaged in that one way by its one-party state. I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm saying that when you have a continuity and you're not changing governments every 4 years, and then there's a different set of policy priorities and a different focus and a different ideology that comes into play, you're just kind of picking away at this one problem on this one path. That's simplistic. Of course, there have been adjustments along the way to tech policy and regulation, but not big ones, right? The fundamental tech policy that was formulated 20 years ago, those words still appear in tech policy documents now. Those ideas have carried forward, that kind of progression is carried forward. So I think, building on the basis of that early foundation and idea, and then having a linear trajectory towards it is probably just, China, it doesn't matter what area you're looking at, China's good at doing it quick. Right. So you move fast and break things. I often say Chinese regulators behave like startups. Right. So I think that's why.
And I think, there's that famous, Bill Clinton quote about, China regulating the internet would be like, stapling Jell-O, to a wall.
Whoops. Well, they got the stapler out, didn't they? They're still stapling like mad. And I don't think he was necessarily wrong. We watch censorship policy all the time, right? And censorship that's playing into AI now, right? Now there's this so that's a wonderful example and speaks to exactly some of the problems with AI development. So, China's rolled out this massive censorship apparatus that started on websites. And then, oh God, now there's mobile apps. How are we going to, regulate oh God, there's social media. And now it's not just newspapers publishing thing, it's users. And oh God, now we're at generative AI, something no one was talking about 12 months ago, something that was not on Chinese regulators' radar 6 months ago. And now there's already regulation about it. They, just threw something out the door in 6 months because you got to get something on paper because, oh God, this thing. But the, critical concerns about, how are we going to deal with censorship in this context, right? So anyway, yeah, I think you're right. They're still stapling is the answer to that.
So just following on from you mentioned generative AI, and I think in the West, so much of work life has been revolutionized by ChatGPT, and ChatGPT hasn't been even out more than 12 months yet, and it's already had such a huge impact on life in the West. I was wondering if you could tell us about China's experience with generative AI and whether China uses ChatGPT or whether there's an equivalent, and whether there's particular tensions within that type of AI within China.
Sure. So OpenAI doesn't make, the company that made ChatGPT doesn't make ChatGPT available in China officially. So officially, China doesn't have access to ChatGPT. Unofficially, all my Chinese friends have ChatGPT accounts, which they have purchased through a variety of kind of back channels. ChatGPT, just like it did everywhere else, sparked this generative AI fever. And what you got was most of the major tech platforms in China have started rolling out. A day does not go by when a tech platform doesn't announce a new generative AI model that they're working on, right? Everybody's wading into the pool. The most notable equivalent of ChatGPT was created by Baidu, China's major search engine. It's called Ernie Bot. But we're at a really interesting juncture there because ChatGPT came out just as China was in the process, regulators were in the process of rolling out some other AI regulations, right? And then ChatGPT hits. And the regulators freaked out. And like, as I said, they sat down to write generative AI regulations very quickly, right? They just came out last week, if anybody's interested in reading them. I mean, this is brand new stuff, right? This is like moving super quick. And what we've heard from contacts at tech companies in China is all of them are waiting for the regulators basically came to them, Alibaba and Baidu and, JD and all these companies and said, look, do not just go rolling out generative AI models without talking to us. You need to wait till these regulations are done. And then we can look at, right, approving these models one by one and rolling them out step by step, right? So China's sitting on, so effectively, all these tech companies are frantically doing R&D on generative AI and putting all these models into place, but they are waiting on the regulators to get it together. And the regulators are also moving relatively quickly on this one. But it is a bottleneck, right? It is hampering innovation to, put out their models and really go for it publicly. So I think the latter half of this year, now that those regulations are out, right? I think the latter half of this year, we start seeing a big outpouring of Chinese chat or generative AI tools hit the market.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And look, I've got one final question for you, Kendra, and I think you've touched on it with a little bit of that. I guess, it's another point of tension between, the private sector in China, the entrepreneurs. When we think of tech in the West, we think of Silicon Valley, we think of, entrepreneurial startups that really drive that sector. But as you've touched on, there is that industrial policy of AI and tech in China. So I was just looking if you can, shed some light on, to what extent does industrial policy play a role in tech in China? And just if you could tease out some of that relationship between the interweaving of the state and private sector around tech.
Sure. I mean, so pulling out a little bit, right? So the companies doing the most with AI in China are these big platform companies, right? It's Baidu, it's Alibaba, it's ByteDance, it's JD. Those are the companies that are really driving it forward. There's also some hardware manufacturers that are doing surveillance technologies. There's SenseTime, there's Hikvision, there's these kind of facial recognition, ID cameras and stuff like that. So, but mostly in terms of consumer facing, generative AI type stuff, it's the platform companies, right? And anybody who follows China tech at all knows that the relationship between the state and platform companies is very fraught. It has been a roller coaster of a love-hate relationship, again, for 2 decades, right? And really the reason for that is because regulators have always struggled, policymakers have struggled with figuring out where platform companies fit into the socialist market economy, right? Xi Jinping doesn't want Silicon Valley. He looked over there and said, okay, well, now you've got yes, those companies are very innovative, but they are in direct opposition to their government all the time, right? They're working at cross purposes. They're fighting in Congress. They're, mavericks. That's not what we want. But we do want a strong internet platform sector and an AI sector. So how do we get there, right? Mm-hmm. And throughout 2020 and 2021 and 2022, again, if you follow China tech, the big headline was, regulators finally just went, backing up a tiny bit, for years, platform companies were considered national champions. They could do no wrong. They were growing. They were really, showing that socialism works and, this is what you get out of it. And they were using that to kind of run run roughshod over the rules and ignore them. Regulators got very sick of it. And for the last 2-3 years have come in and kind of cracked down on tech companies, right? And now, as of over the last year, they're back in favor with the state, right? Crackdown's over. Last week, top leadership said, we're done. Go get them, Tiger. So it's been a real rocky roller coaster. When they're in favor, there's lots of subsidies and support. When they're out of favor, there's lots of crackdowns and rules. Ultimately, though, when it comes to AI, where we're at right now is that the state has essentially, so after this crackdown, the understanding, the relationship between the state and tech companies is this. The state agrees, hey, we're going to tell you what the rules are before we punish you for them, for breaking them, right? And we're going to give you lots of state support, right? In return, you must honor your responsibilities, first to state objectives by putting R&D money into areas like AI and areas of strong state priorities. Secondly, to society, meaning consumers and your employees. And third, last on the list, to investors, right? We still want you to make money, right? But in that order of priority. And so essentially where we're at now is that the state is rolling out lots of subsidies and support for AI development and chip development, right? Which underpins AI. And companies are then expected to take that money and put it towards, business models that support state goals. One of those goals is the development of AI. But again, I think those there's a lot of, it's not that the state came in and said, you must develop AI, and Alibaba didn't want to do that. And then they said, oh, well, okay, I guess we're an AI company now. It's more that, Ali's developing in this direction where they may have used AI for something public facing or consumer facing, or they may have gone in this direction with their business model with no state intervention. The state's like, look, we're going to give you money, but, work with our universities to help develop AI programs, right? Pump money into helping startups get off the ground in the AI space, support the entire ecosystem, right? Foster some innovation and move us forward along this path, and then we'll support you. Mm-hmm. So, an agreement has been made to have a more copacetic relationship. I don't think it's going to be that smooth. It never is. But that's kind of where things stand.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Kendra. And if anyone has a question for Kendra, please drop it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Mark, we'll now turn to you. And Kendra's already touched on, some of the government crackdown on China's digital payment market with Alibaba and Tencent, being fined earlier this year. From your vantage point, Mark, you work with a lot of Western companies that are very dependent on these platforms. Could you tell us, what it looks like now for digital platforms in China and how Western firms are using them post that crackdown?
Yeah, I think the crackdowns have received a lot of negative media, and in many cases it has been pretty tough, both for China as a whole economically, but also for innovation, etc. But from a brand perspective, there's been some good positives come from it, such as in the past there were walled gardens. All these platforms were religiously disallowed any kind of cross-pollination between the different platforms. And now WeChat can talk to Alibaba or Taobao, and you can kind of do some pretty clever things between them as a marketer. So that's been great. And you're seeing Alibaba voluntarily break out into, I think it's 7 different entities that they are planning to list over the next few years. And again, that will be good for a lot of brands because it'll probably encourage innovation. You're not having the e-commerce division of Alibaba getting dragged down by these loss-making divisions, so they can kind of focus on just that. And you're also, when you've got smaller, more nimble entities, you're going to be less corporate, which I've noticed in the last decade, Alibaba has become a bit of a corporate beast. And particularly over the last few years, you've seen them being a lot less innovative, hence loss of market share. And that's not great for both brands or the Chinese economy, employment, all these issues that Beijing faces right now. Obviously, youth unemployment is in June hit 21.3%. And last year, Alibaba dropped over 15,000 jobs. And similarly, Tencent was close to 10,000, Meituan. A lot of these platforms cut back on jobs just due to the lack of confidence and certainty in the market. But now we're seeing certainty. We're going to see some more hiring. Alibaba have already said they're going to hire more than 10,000 again this year. Investment's probably going to be more natural in the way it flows. And again, the last couple of years, we saw a lot of money that would have traditionally gone to these fast-growing tech firms get funneled into less efficient categories such as consumer packaged goods. So you had these consumer packaged goods that were absolutely flush with money, and they're throwing the likes of 70 to 80% of all their revenue is going towards marketing, which is unsustainable by any measure. But because they've got all this money that they wouldn't have traditionally had, they're putting it into places that are not very, they don't really stack, and that shakes the whole category. So hopefully now we'll see a little more of a balance between where the investment's going and just from a consumer and a branding standpoint. We'll likely see more international competitiveness. Obviously, this is very big and important for China, particularly in the AI space and the chip space that we've talked about earlier. But also the innovation. Now there's certainty. Now there is investment coming back in. And hopefully this consumption, which has obviously been the elephant in the room for Beijing. They're hoping to grow GDP continue to grow GDP. And a lot of that is based on the hope that consumption will improve. And if you look at China, it's still a very stubborn around that late 30% of GDP, whereas the likes of America, where Kendra is sitting, they're up around the almost at 70%, globally, a little over 60%. So no one is better placed to really drive consumption as these channels. They make shopping more entertaining, more enjoyable, more convenient, more efficient. And so they need both online and offline. A lot of them, their tentacles are everywhere. So it's really going to help drive and meet a lot of these goals. So a lot of these priorities that Beijing had when they were doing the clampdowns, some of them have kind of been deprioritized, all for trying to retain this economic growth that China so dearly loves and needs.
Now that the rules have more or less been set and there's, I guess, guardrails formed as to, where those big tech platforms can play when it comes to digital payment systems, do you see, Mark, that Alibaba and Tencent retaining their dominance of that platform market in China, or do you feel that there's now room for other platforms to enter the market and for it to be, much more competitive and therefore more options for Western businesses?
It's a good question, James, and it's something that has actually Alibaba and Tencent have actually lost share over the last couple of years, and some of it may be due to the clampdown, the fact that they've kind of had their attention diverted to the regulations rather than innovating. And then ByteDance has come sweeping in on their horse, and they've really taken a lot of market share from these traditional players. If you look at fashion, for example, they sell more fashion products by value than Tmall does. Food and beverage has had about 70% of the value of Tmall is now sold on Douyin. So you're starting to see a real shift in the way that consumers are shopping. They're looking for entertainment. And that may actually shift back now. Now Alibaba is again retaining focus on trying to grow and trying to innovate, and as I said, separating their entities. So we may see the giants actually clawing back some share. But hopefully, and I'm sure Beijing will be pushing for this, there'll be some new, young, innovative companies coming up and really helping share the choice for consumers and brands.
Mark, you touched on there being some recent changes across, behaviours on Chinese consumers on e-commerce platforms, and I guess there's always change being such a fluid system. But what changes came out of the pandemic with regards to how Chinese consumers engage in online platforms? And are we seeing that some of these changes are now permanent? Have these been permanent changes, or was this more an adjustment phase for consumers to deal with a lot of the struggles domestically in China throughout COVID-19?
It's a good question. A lot of the changes were already happening, but they accelerated as a result of COVID. There's been some categories that have been impacted more, things like luxury, where historically consumers would travel to these far-flung European, American, Tokyo, Hong Kong, these types of places, and buy their luxury goods that accounted for the majority share. And obviously with COVID, they couldn't travel. Their agents buying on their behalf couldn't buy from abroad or couldn't send them. So a lot of that was repatriated, and a lot of that went online, particularly with the younger generations coming up and buying. So things like luxury has really increased, things like food and beverage, and that started out of necessity. Everyone was obviously locked down in early 2020, and they couldn't buy any food, and they needed to eat. So the infrastructure really shifted focus towards pushing food and beverage products. Even the farmers, these poor farmers out in the countryside, a lot of their produce was rotting. So the platforms really focused on managing to get these consumers or get these products out to consumers. So they improved the supply chains, they improved the cold chain logistics, all these types of things to make it better. And a lot of that's stayed. Similarly, you've got new demographics, the elderly, who have traditionally been quite standoffish for online shopping and things, and now they were forced to shop online as a matter of survival. And so now they've learnt they quite like it, and so they're shopping a lot more online than they used to, and a lot of that stayed. But as I said, you're getting different channels now that are really taking hold. Live streaming has obviously been booming, and that in itself is changing. Like if you look at traditional e-commerce, you get about a 3% conversion rate. People that come to your store, about 3% of them will end up buying. Whereas on live streaming, that rate can be as high as 30%. So there's a massive difference, and that's really driven both brands to sell on live stream, but also consumers wanting to buy it. But that's changing. You're getting less celebrity type sales on these live streams, and more brand focused, and even virtual idols and all these wacky metaverse type things that are happening. So yeah, there's constant changes, but that's, as I'm sure Ting-Fang and Kendra will tell you, that's kind of par for course in China. There's always going to be these changes.
Yeah, indeed. Just a final reminder to attendees, if you have a question, please drop it into the Q&A box and we'll get to it before we finish. Mark, just a final question for you, and coming back to our theme on geopolitical tensions and how that's impacting China tech. Ting-Fang has touched on semiconductors. Kendra's talked about AI. For digital platforms, it is a little different. It is more seen on the consumer level. I was just looking to get a read from you on what we're seeing in terms of consumer behavior when it comes to these geopolitical tensions. Are we now seeing more patriotism towards national brands in China? Is there a push for Chinese people to buy Chinese goods? Just looking to get a sense of what you've seen, being so close to the sector.
Yeah, there's no question there's rising patriotism, and I think that's happened everywhere around the world. With COVID, people have been a lot more insular. They haven't travelled so much. They haven't studied abroad in the way that they have, so they've been a little more closed-minded for products and brands. But at the same time, that was already happening. And we saw it around 2015, 2016. There was a real noticeable change in the way that consumers were much more accepting of domestic brands. And then with COVID, that really got a lot more noticeable. One, because of this nationalism that was already increasing, but also a lot of foreign brands were kind of stuck outside the country. A lot of these key decision makers hadn't been to China in years, didn't really know what was going on, didn't realize how rapidly it was changing. So a lot of these brands weren't adapting to the changing market. Whereas obviously local brands, which were getting better and better as it was, they had feet on the ground and key decision makers on the ground that were rapidly evolving with the evolving market. And that meant that a lot of their products, a lot of their positioning and messaging, and even the channels they were using was a lot more relevant to Chinese consumers. So whilst nationalism has impacted that, I think it's a too commonly used excuse for brands that are not performing in China. A lot of them, it's just they've fallen behind a little bit just from being out of touch with the market.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Mark. I just had a question for all of the panelists. As I said at the top, we're hearing a lot of usage of the terms de-risking and decoupling. I was just looking to get a sense from the panel, are we seeing decoupling take place when we talk about, the West's relationship with China? Or do you feel, is de-risking, a softer phrase that we should be using that, leaves a door open for opportunities in the market? Ting-Fang, I might start with you first.
Yes, thank you very much. I think de-risking could be a more precise word. And I want to talk about this trend from the hardware supply chain point of view. I think the impact of the US-China tech war actually is still bigger than we can imagine. It has already triggered many supply chain shift, despite the supply chain shift is very slow, but it's indeed happening. We are seeing some regional electronic hubs are growing very fast, which we never saw before the US-China geopolitical tension. For example, Vietnam, it's a very important place that we need to watch in terms of hardware. It has attracted so many new investment, and it already got computer production from Dell and Microsoft, and also their suppliers. And also it already got Apple's AirPod production, iPad, and some new MacBook production coming out of there, although it's starting from this year, but it's significant because all the past decades is all in China. Also, it's not only about final assembly in Vietnam. There are many electronic components companies going to Vietnam about casing, connector, display module, and other electronic modules. So the ecosystem is emerging over there. And we also see India obviously have very big ambition to upgrade its value chain thanks to the massive supply chain shift from China. Also, we see Mexico and Thailand got many data center server production. That did not happen before the US-China tension. It's really the era of regional manufacturing emerging. And then still, it's true that everyone can argue that all the companies are not completely leave China. China is still their biggest production hub, but they are really building a new capacity somewhere else. So I think the US-China tech war is having a long tail effect, and that could eventually have some economic consequences on China's economy, because previously China relied so much on foreign manufacturers to help them upgrade the economy and then the supply chain and then create a lot of jobs. But now China really also need to rethink about the new growth drivers for its economy as major tech companies are reducing reliance on the country. For sure, that the trend is here to stay.
Thank you, Ting-Fang. Ting-Fang, we've just got a question from our Executive Director at ASPI, the China Center for Analysis, on the intensifying US efforts to enlist other countries, so allies in Europe, allies in Asia, to stem the flow of technologies, manufacturing equipment, chips, investment. Do you think this is going to work in terms of how the US is able to bring other countries to its cause? Bates says we've seen some buy in Japan and the Netherlands, but some pushback from South Korea and Taiwan. How do you see this shaking out, Ting-Fang?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think we are all still monitoring whether the Netherlands and Japan, they both roll out their export control regime earlier this year, and they were going to effect very soon. But we what we heard from the business side, because I always cover technology and the company side, I think all the companies don't want export control at all, because actually sometimes they are also very concerned about the ambiguity of export control, like whether the US is really going to be that tough on China, or whether US could change their mind and then become more soft. Like if I am Japan and the Netherlands, and then I roll out such a like extreme export control regime, but my counterparts in the US later soften, then maybe I need to adjust as well. So I think all these countries are still monitor whether and then how the execution will like determine what's going to happen next. But after all, I still feel like China, of course, it wants to be self-reliant, but it also previously, I think it can be cut off from US, but if they can make friends from like European friends and then Japanese friends, South Korea friends, then they are totally fine. But if all these allies are really on the same page, then that would be quite a harsh thing for China. Otherwise, it could be like some kind of paper tiger for the longer term. So we are still looking at that.
Thanks, Ting-Fang.
Do you mind if I comment on that question as well?
Oh, yeah. Great.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's really interesting here is that what we think is going to happen is that China is going to pull, in terms of retaliation, is that China is going to pull out the trade war playbook, because they've already done it. And the trade war playbook, if you'll remember, from all the way back in ancient history in 2018, is that the US does something and China does something exactly targeted to be a specific response to that one thing. And the US does something and China does something. Now, look at what has happened in the last couple of weeks, right? You have the US, over the last few months, US imposed export controls, then it went around, lobbied all of its allies, right? Please join us in this stuff. Some more reluctantly, some less so. Everybody basically got on board, but with, varying levels of agreement in terms of how they were going to be implemented, right? While those decisions were being made, Beijing went around and lobbied the Dutch. They went and had a bunch of meetings with Japan. There was, saying essentially, please don't do this. They were ignored. The export controls came into place. And then once they did, the Chinese ambassador said, if you do this, you're going to be in big trouble. And then as soon as that decision was made, China put in its own export controls on these critical minerals, right? And so now, right, we're in that same Mexican standoff in the sense that South Korea and, or Japan and the Netherlands, rather, as exactly as Ting-Fang just mentioned, well, now they're in a weird position, because if one of them imports or implements export controls very, very strongly, China can now implement its own export controls very, very strongly against that one country while everybody else watches what happens, right? So China's now trying to build a policy toolkit amongst which export controls are one, so that it can respond in precise measure and in kind, right, to whoever acts against it. So I think that's my guess, that we're basically going to see, basically what that does is incentivize US allies not to go too hard on the implementation. The controls are already written. Right now, it's about whether or not they use them and how much they use them, right? And can you weaken the relationship between China, Japan, or Japan, the Netherlands, the US, and all, allies by playing them off against each other and just making it incredibly difficult to stick together on the implementation of those controls? I think the jury's out, but I think that's where we're going.
Mark, very quickly from you, in 30 seconds, where do you see things going in terms of, Western companies selling online to China, and, I guess navigating some of that geopolitical risk?
Yeah, I think China, if you look at what IMF is forecast, they're going to account for around 23% of global growth over the next 5 years. And the middle class is expected to be about 25% of global middle class, depending on what that measure is. And so I don't think China's going away, particularly for large, ambitious companies. But for a lot of companies, they are finding it more and more challenging to succeed in the market, and particularly those ones that are trying to dip their toes in the way that a lot of brands traditionally have. Like something about China now, you've got to be boots and all, you've got to have feet on the ground, you've got to invest, and you've got to be quite strategic in the way you approach the market. And if you don't do that, you're not going to make money, you're going to lose a lot of money. And there's the added risk of consumers in the West are more aware and more vocal about other issues, and particularly issues around China, whether it be human rights, whether it be things like animal testing and stuff, which has only recently got more easy for beauty companies. But we saw it with Barbie, and Warner Bros. Were probably regretting some of the things that, whether intentional or not, happened in the Barbie movie around some crazy dotted lines and a strange blob of a map of Asia. And now Vietnam has banned the movie, and there's a few guys in the Philippines that are pushing for the same. Similarly with the Olympics, you saw a lot of global sponsors for the Olympics really dial up their sponsorship in China for the Beijing Winters. But in the rest of the world, it really, they toned it down quite a lot. So you're seeing more and more of this kind of balance between keeping consumers on both sides of the argument as happy as you can. So it's more of a balancing act than it ever has been. I expect that will get more and more challenging.
All right. Well, excellent. Thanks, Mark. And I guess if Barbie's safe, no one is, from the geopolitical impact that we're seeing across some of these sectors in China. So I'm mindful that we're just over time. So huge thanks to our speakers today, Cheng Ting-Fang from Nikkei Asia, Kendra Schaefer from Trivium China, and Mark Tanner from China Skinny. I've really loved the discussion today. This webinar will also be going up on Asia Society's global YouTube page if anyone would like to rewatch. We're also just going to drop in some information about our speakers in the chat. Ting-Fang has a Nikkei Asia webinar on Thursday, so you can find the link to that to register in the chat. Mark will drop in the China Skinny subscription link. So this is to subscribe to China Skinny's leading newsletter to get all your information about online trends in China. And Kendra will drop your Twitter in the chat for people to follow you and the work you do at Trivium China. So thank you once again to our speakers. Thank you again to the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for their support of our China Executive Briefing series. Don't forget you can read all of our reports through the series on the China Executive Briefing website that we'll be adding into the chat box now as well. And just before I leave you, just a quick announcement that we're very excited to announce that to close out our China Executive Briefing series, we'll be bringing Jörg Wuttke to Australia. So Mr. Jörg Wuttke is the President Emeritus at the EU Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. He has over 4 decades of working with Western businesses in China. Jörg regularly meets the most senior European officials visiting China, and we're really looking forward to bringing him to Australia, sharing his insights on China's economy and the current state of play for Western businesses on the ground in China. So please keep an eye out on our Asia Society Australia comms for a series of public and private engagements with Jörg in September. And thanks again to the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for supporting Jörg's visit. Well, that brings today's session to a close. 3 minutes over time, but I'm glad we got to fit in so much with our fantastic panel today. Thank you again to my colleague, Julia Oregia, for helping on the back end of this program. Thank you, attendees and Asia Society Australia members, for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.